2008 was a weird time for Marvel fans. Things were great-ish if you were a fan of the X-Men and Spider-Man, but if you were a fan of the other characters, all you really had were the comics and fighting games. But then, the guy who directed Elf decided that wasn't good enough. The world needed to see why Iron Man, of all characters, deserved to be more than some obscure comic book hero. And you really don't need someone like me to tell you that Jon Favreau absolutely pulled that off. The original Iron Man is really, really good. A lot of what people like about the MCU, and a lot of what we don't, can be traced back to this movie. So, it helps to pay a little respect to our elders.
I think this guy talks a lot, and it's about time for him to learn some respect.
You can feel the influence of Iron Man through the entire MCU, and I bet will continue to for years to come. So, let's check out why Iron Man is still pretty good. In my Batman Begins re-review, I explained how origin superhero movies can be roughly split in two halves, with one half devoted to the superhero's origin, and the other half devoted to the superhero's struggle. Hopefully, you check that out, and I'm not just saying that to shamelessly plug myself. Iron Man takes what worked in Batman Begins, like the heavy character focus, and mostly fixes what didn't. Mostly. Like Batman Begins, the first act of Iron Man is dedicated to establishing our main hero. And it's here when you see the bigger differences between the two when it comes to establishing characters. While I gave Christian Bale praise for his portrayal of Batman, I also pointed out how the script could have given him a little more to work with. His motivations are fleshed out, but as far as personality, he could have had more besides being a little sassy sometimes. Obviously, he has a personality, but if you need someone on the internet to point out the subtleties, nuance, and psychology of a character, the movie didn't do its job well enough. It's the movie's job to show all that to the audience, not ours. I mention this because if there's one thing Tony Stark is full of, it's personality. From his very first line, you can already get a general idea of who Tony Stark is as a person. Sarcastic, a little rough around the edges, but charming. But not even 10 minutes into the movie, it's apparent that Tony Stark is an awful person. He's dismissive of everyone's opinion, never takes anything seriously, and revels in the creation and selling of weapons of mass destruction.
To peace.
Even his friends can only tolerate him for so long. Tony Stark is near the bottom of the barrel as a person, which is a great starting point for a character. His character has nowhere to go but up, and the journey of a terrible person learning to become a better one is something that draws people in. It's an easy arc to understand and get invested in. The combination of strong personality and character progression is one of the bigger reasons why Tony Stark is a cultural icon. And it goes without saying that the other big reason is Robert Downey Jr. himself. He brings that combination of charm, swagger, and most importantly, humanity to the role that makes the journey so engaging.
I shouldn't be alive. Unless it was for a reason. I'm not crazy, Pepper. I just finally know what I have to do.
There's the argument that Downey is just playing himself, but that's not a bad thing. Tony Stark has an actual personality. Some of the other Avengers take more than one movie to get one at all. When people think of iconic superhero portrayals, there's a reason you don't see Christian Bale's Batman or Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man in the same conversation as, say, Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool or Downey's Iron Man. While those portrayals aren't that bad by any means, they lack the extra pizzazz to really bring a character to life. It goes beyond character motivations and character arcs. Characters need that extra touch to make them feel like actual people, with quirks and personality traits beyond their role in a story.
Drive. Cheeseburger first.
If you were to walk up to this Bruce Wayne and say hi, you could probably get a vague idea of how he'd respond. Your mileage may vary based on what you pick up about his personality from the movies. On the other hand, I bet you don't have to spend more than a minute thinking about how Tony Stark would respond.
No, throw it up, I'm kidding.
Exceptional character writing and acting is what makes the first act of Iron Man so great to watch. This act sets up Stark's character, only to blow it to smithereens. Not only is it satisfying to watch this smug jerk get taken down a peg, but it's engaging to see how Tony and Yinsen work through such a dire situation. Yinsen's only role in this movie is to be Tony's Uncle Ben, so to speak, But it's cool that his dying words,
Don't waste it. Don't waste your life.
are Tony's mantra until the very end. Another thing worth mentioning is the humor. Marvel gets a lot of flack for being overly quippy and
Tell me, Mr. Doctor.
All right, look, my name is Dr. Stephen Strange.
You are a doctor.
Yeah.
I'm Ant-Man. Ant-Man? What, you haven't heard of me? No, you wouldn't have heard of me.
You got some nerve. I'll give you that.
You could use some of that right now.
yeah, they definitely deserve it. But there's some key differences in Iron Man compared to its peers. For starters, the humor is paced really well. The movie shows restraint when too much humor might ruin the stakes of the current situation. For example, in the first act, there's humor throughout the flashback sequence. But once we come back to Afghanistan, the next joke doesn't come for another 20 minutes, right here. And in that scene, you can see that quips aren't the only source of humor. There's a lot of other visual gags just like that, and cuts like this.
Now, what am I supposed to tell the press?
Training exercise, isn't that the usual BS?
It's not that simple. An unfortunate training exercise and
When the movie does use quips, they don't really overstay their welcome.
I do anything and everything that Mr. Stark requires, including occasionally taking out the trash. Will that be all?
Of course, the other movies have their fair share of good lines and good moments, but the bad ones tend to fall into that strange, artificial style that got annoying after a while. And the quippy humor fits more with Tony Stark's character than most of the other MCU characters. It's kinda weird to hear Black Widow or Hawkeye crack one-liners at times, but based on what we've seen of Iron Man, it makes sense for him to do it, even if it gets kind of annoying. After all, Tony himself can be kind of annoying. Another thing I like about this movie isn't exclusive to the first act, but it's something you notice here and feel throughout the rest of the movie, which is the sound design. For instance, the Mark I is this big chonker of a suit, and it feels like one. The later suits are cool in their own way, but the sound design and scenes like this really make them feel like the hunks of metal they're supposed to be. If it wasn't obvious, I really like the first act of Iron Man. It's very character driven, and it does a wonderful job of giving the audience reasons to watch this character's journey. Getting the audience invested in the main character is one of the most important things you need to do in any movie, let alone a superhero movie. And it's a lot easier said than done, just look at the later movies. In any case, Tony's return to the US starts the second act. While he tinkers around with the suits, the rest of the act revolves around the ripple effects of his new worldview. Which makes a lot of sense. If you or I did a complete 180, most of our friends would be skeptical too. As for Tony's friends, Rhodey is a character? He's mostly the straight man to Stark's antics and is perfectly serviceable at that. Nothing more and nothing less. I know there's a whole Terrence Howard versus Don Cheadle debate, but if you ask me, they're basically the same. Cheadle is probably a little better, if only because he gets more screen time, but even in later movies, his most memorable moment is getting sniped by Vision. On the other hand, you can't say the same thing about Pepper. In the Batman Begins video, I made it a point to explain how Rachel Dawes is a great example of how to do a bad movie romance. In short, Rachel has no genuine reason to be interested in Bruce, and the movie spends very little time on building a friendship, let alone a relationship. If you swap Rachel out for Harvey Dent, nothing really changes. When your character is as interchangeable as a freaking Mr. Potato Head piece, they're barely a character. They're a plot device with a face. And this is important because Pepper Potts is the complete opposite of Rachel Dawes. Not only is she an example of a good movie romance, but she's an actual character with agency in the movie. It's established early that Tony and Pepper have known each other for a long time. The movie points out how vital she is in his day-to-day life, and even if that wasn't mentioned, from the way they talk with each other, you can tell these two aren't strangers.
It's your birthday.
Yes.
I knew that. Already?
Yeah, isn't that strange? It's the same day as last year.
Well, get yourself something nice for me.
I already did.
And?
Oh, it was very nice.
Yeah.
Very tasteful.
There's an actual back and forth dynamic that's fun to watch. Since the characters have history, and the actors are given both screen time and material, it's very easy for us to connect the dots and see how this friendship can blossom into a romance. which says a lot considering how difficult it is to build a romance in a 2-hour movie. And she's not just a love interest, she's a key player throughout the film. She's usually doing the more mundane plot stuff, but she plays a vital role in bringing down the bad guy from behind the scenes, and in a more literal way in the final battle. The fact that she's involved in the main plot makes her feel less like just a love interest and more like Tony's partner, which is what a well-written romance should feel like, a partnership. While she doesn't get a chance to fight side by side with Tony until Endgame, it's cool that she was one of the more proactive MCU heroines since day one. Most people would say that Tony and Pepper are the best MCU couple, and I'd agree with that. While it's good in this movie, the extra screen time throughout the MCU helps flesh their relationship out even more. You get to see the good parts and the rough patches. Their relationship takes a backseat in the later films, but the lack of focus later doesn't diminish how good it is here. While the second act's main plot isn't as tense as the first, it's still pretty solid. The external conflict is the under-the-table arms dealing at Stark Industries, but Tony's internal conflict is still the primary focus here. It's something that's very human. Somebody who's changed for the better, but struggles with the fact that nobody believes they've changed. It's something that's easy for people to understand or relate to. You compare this conflict to, say, Captain Marvel's, and it's easy to see why Iron Man is an icon, but Captain Marvel is a footnote.
Her?
And this isn't to say Carol Danvers has no motivation or conflict. Someone struggling with who they are is a fantastic internal conflict that can resonate with a lot of people. But it's not presented well in her movie. Great ideas only get you so far. You also need to execute them properly so it resonates with the audience. This is exactly why Iron Man works so well. It takes these simple ideas and presents them in ways people can understand. So when a scene like this plays out, we understand the gist of what's going on and what's going to happen as Tony's frustration builds. It isn't long until he gets sick of waiting and decides to take matters into his own hands.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
While I like the build-up to his return to Afghanistan, the scene when he confronts a terrorist is mostly just cool. And that's fine. Not everything has to be this character-focused, dramatic moment. And it's a good way to showcase how potent the Iron Man suit is. Later on, Raza explains how the Iron Man suit is one of the deadliest weapons in human history, and the fact that Tony bodies these jabronis with no effort shows how something like this can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Speaking of Raza, the scene where Stain gets rid of him is about when the third act starts.
I ain't done yet.
It's no secret that the third act of Iron Man is the weakest part of the movie. This is about where the character focus of the first two acts takes a backseat in favor of the dumb superhero stuff. It's almost the inverse of what we've seen so far. Instead of the main focus being on internal conflicts, the focus is now on an external threat that needs to be taken care of. And compared to earlier external conflicts, this new one sucks. Obadiah Stane isn't a good villain. I know, it's a really hot take these days. So, it's here where I ask you, the viewer, a question. What do you think makes a good villain? And why do you think Stane isn't a good one? Take a minute or two to think about it. You got it? I ask because everyone has their own idea of what makes a good villain, and what I mentioned may or may not line up with what you're thinking of. I'm no authority on this, but when you watch and read a lot of stuff, you start to see some trends. The first thing most people may think of is that a good villain needs a good motivation. After all, there's a saying that a villain is just the hero of their own story. You see this in a lot of the better Marvel villains like Zemo, Killmonger, and the big man himself, T-Dog. Each of these villains have something interesting that drives them to act. But there's a counter to this. What about villains like or Hannibal Lecter? Or Frieza? You want to know what Frieza's motivation is?
Hello, I have such high expectations for you.
He's just Space Hitler. But none of these villains are bad. In fact, they're among the best in their respective series. So another way to write a good villain is to just make them entertaining. It's okay for a villain to be black and white as long as they're fun to watch, whether it's the theatricality or flexing how overpowered they are. But even if a villain has the best motivation and oozes charisma, none of it matters if they're never around, which is why most villains need time. The lack of meaningful screen time is what holds back many potentially good villains. Any potential in their motivation or entertainment is lost if you have no time to show that. There's a few other things worth mentioning, like narrative or thematic significance, but I didn't want to make this tangent too long. These are important because many villains in any story usually accomplish two of these three objectives, with the best villains usually doing all three. if not going beyond that, and most of the lamer ones usually fail to do any of them all that well. Think back to some of your favorite bad guys, and hopefully you see what I mean. If you can't think of any, I'll show you with a little lightning round. The Vulture. Simple but understandable motivation. Good performance by Michael Keaton, and he's around for the whole movie. Great villain. Director Hayward. Boring motivation. Very dull to watch. But he's around for a long time. Not so great a villain. T Supreme. Compelling but flawed motivation. Is entertaining due to his strength, humanity, and Josh Brolin's performance. And he gets an entire movie to himself. Great villain. With the TED Talk out of the way, let's take another look at Obadiah Stane. His motivations basically boil down to
Money, please.
corporate greed is really hard to make interesting no matter how skilled a writer you are. But you can roll with it if Stane is at least entertaining to watch, and I actually think he is. Sometimes. You can tell Jeff Bridges is putting in some work, like here.
Honestly, it's impossible. Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
He's really intimidating when he needs to be, but he only gets like 2 scenes like this. After he steals Tony's heart, he basically becomes cartoonishly evil. It's like the movie skips a scene or something. He gets drunk on the power of the Warmonger suit within minutes of wearing it. And while that's definitely something to work with, he explodes before we get a chance to see any more, which ends up leaving Stane with a lackluster motivation, some, but not a lot of entertainment, and not a lot of meaningful screen time. Not so great of a villain. But despite the weak third act, I can kind of see the reasoning behind it. I gave Batman Begins a lot of flack for its third act too, because it has all the ingredients for a great finale, like a master and student relationship between the hero and villain, but the movie ignores that for a stupid set piece. On the other hand, Iron Man doesn't really have that much to work with in this department. There aren't that many plot threads left to pull from for a compelling finale. Besides Stane, who hasn't done anything for most of the movie besides be Tony's hype man and take away his pizza. The only potential change I can think of comes from the scene with Raza and Stane, where Raza mentions his soldiers getting Iron Man suit equivalents. It had been thematically fitting for Tony to have a round 2 with the terrorists, but with an even playing field this time. It would have hammered home the idea that his actions, no matter how good they are now, still have consequences he needs to take responsibility for. But hindsight is 2020, so take some of these criticisms with a handful of salt. It's way easier to critique something and make suggestions years after it's released. Even my proposed changes might have been too bizarre or risky for a movie like this back then. The safer option is the one we got, however lame it is. Anyways, the third act sucks. It set a precedent of mediocre climaxes and villains that Marvel grew out of. Mostly. But thankfully, it's over quickly, and the movie ends not long after the final battle. I don't think it's that crazy to say Iron Man is one of the best Phase 1 movies. It takes a lot of talent to turn a B-list superhero into a household name. It was so influential that the later movies took parts like the snappy humor and superhero battles, but lost sight of what tied it all together, the character writing.
I am Iron Man.
It has missteps for sure, but they aren't bad enough to ruin the movie. Part of me wishes I had more legitimate criticisms, but anything else I thought of borders on being nitpicky. If I were to tier this movie with the other MCU movies, I'd put it right here, in the A tier. I realize that by doing this, I might be dooming myself to having to rank all the MCU movies, but to that I say,
Bring it on!
It's by no means a Citizen Kane, let alone the best superhero movie, but it's set a bar that the MCU wouldn't match for a few movies. And all this is coming from someone who used to hate this movie. When I first saw this in theaters, I could not understand the hype for it.
Especially these flavorless, unremarkable Marvel movies.
Oh, they are so not a big deal.
I know!
It's just all there is.
Yes!
While part of that was me being a young and stupid hipster, I can see there's a lot to appreciate about this movie years later. And I think it's really cool that even dozens of movies later, at the end of the Infinity Saga, Marvel didn't forget its roots either.